everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me back. If we have not met, not to worry. Fresh Start is available at all times. My background looks a little bit different than it did last time you saw me. We're allowed out of the house now, which I'm not sure was true one of the other times that we were meeting. I do have my mask, though, because I am actually here at Chat today. I'm a part-time teacher at Chat, only part-time, so that allows me to have other exciting projects such as this one. So usually I'm able to teach from my office at home, but today I had to be here, so I'm locked up in a little classroom by myself, and I'm hoping that all of the tech and everything else will work. So, we studied some really very exciting and innovative things together when we met last year. Really one of my absolute passions, namely women in Jewish history and other things having to do with women in Judaism. Not so much in terms of the day-to-day ritual aspect. That's the kind of thing that Rabbi Cutler generally handles, but women in history, other issues having to do with Jewish women. I was told that some of the texts that I use, because almost whatever I teach, I need to have a text with me to demonstrate. I'm not the kind of person that just goes on and on and on talking. We'll be looking at text together. I was when I was talking to Randy and Carol, we decided that since I was using text anyway, that maybe it was an opportunity to take a step back and look at rabbinic text kind of writ large and understand a little bit what's going on there. I mean, all of us to a certain extent, I don't know anyone's background here, but I'm assuming that all of us have some notion of some ideas. If I throw around words like Torah, Talmud, Midrash, Mishnah, all those kind of words, people are like, oh yeah, that's important stuff that the ancient rabbis did, and maybe some of the rabbis still do today. But I'm not sure that we have all can easily put together kind of the different, if those are different pieces of the puzzle, can put them together to understand how they work together, what came first, what came afterwards, a little bit about the terminology. So I thought that today, since we would be studying a few texts in depth having to do with this theme of time over our next few weeks together, that today was an opportunity to try to put some of those pieces of the puzzles of that kind of rabbinic literature puzzle together. So that's what we're going to try to do. Now, if it were up to me, I'd be happy with just giving a history lecture, maybe with some text, but I know that history is not everybody's favorite thing. I can't imagine it because it's one of my great loves, but I know it's not for everybody necessarily. So you should know that we're really doing a combo today. We're going to look at one of the most classic, famous rabbinic texts ever from Pirkei Avot, another term that I think many of people have heard of before, but they probably haven't seen it in the way that we're going to be discussing it today. So I want to give you an overall view of what these concepts are and where they fit into history. And then we're going to read a rabbinic perspective, an ancient rabbinic perspective about all of this as well. Overall, what we're doing really today is doing a traditional perspective of this kind of timing. Most of it actually jives very well with current academic study as well. That being said, we're not getting into the ancient biblical stuff. So that's, of course, where archaeology, belief, evolution, dinosaurs, all of that stuff can get a little bit confusing in terms of dates and ideas and beliefs. Again, ask Rabbi Cutler. For our purposes, we are starting with pretty much, well, we're going to mention the Bible, but we're going to start looking at actual dates towards the end of the Bible. Really, all of these things that we're going to be discussing today, we'll see a historical perspective, but there's a lot of academic Jewish studies corroboration for it as well. Okay, and we're going to stop, Randy and Carol are going to stop me halfway through to for questions. I very much welcome questions. I wish we were in a room together where it'd be easier to answer questions as they arise, but because of the technical details of Zoom, it's a little bit trickier. So if you have questions, I think you're allowed to write them in the chat, but I won't be looking at them until the halfway through, or note it down on a piece of paper for yourselves, and then you can ask them at that time. And I very much welcome questions. All right. So as I said, we're going to be looking at text. We might as well go right on over to the screen share and see what I have prepared for you. Here we go. Second. And smaller, and away we go. Okay, time for Talmud historical background. That's what we're calling our class for today. And here we go. All right, so some of this terminology that you might have had or have heard before, I'm sure you have. We're using the word Talmud. I've also kind of thrown around the term oral Torah. That is pretty much synonymous, although the term oral Torah really encompasses even more than the Talmud itself. The confusing thing about the term oral Torah, even though it was originally conveyed orally from mouth to ear, from teacher to student, it was actually eventually written down as well. Excuse me 1 minute. I do not have COVID. That's my asthma that I sometimes get from talking quickly. All right. Here we go. So the oral Torah was eventually written down and becomes written also, but you'll see this is the terminology. I don't blame you if it sounds confusing. By the end of today's hour, I'm going to be hoping to solve that confusion. And click. Here we go. All right, before we start talking about the Talmud and the oral Torah, the Torah of the rabbis, I think it's good to have a very quick recap about the written Torah. So the written Torah also has different names attached to it. Christians call it the Old Testament, which is has some different issues connected to it and problems. I do not use that terminology. In academic circles, it is called the Hebrew Bible. Traditional circles, it is called Tanakh. Tanakh is made up of 3 parts. Hopefully you can see this on your screen. There's obviously a lot of Hebrew here, but I've tried to make it clear for English speakers as well. Oh, I'm sorry, I advanced too quickly. Again, I understand this is review for some people, but I think it's good to try to catch us all up. So the Hebrew Bible is made up of all of these books, separated into 3 sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And when you put the first 3 letters of each of those sections together, it spells this acronym Tanakh: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which is the K, is the same as the Ch in Hebrew as well. So just to kind of get our bearings, Torah are the 5 books of Moses. You might have heard it referred to as the Chumash or the Chumash as well. And of course, these are the books that we read as part of the Torah reading in synagogue, and the ones that are written on the scroll, the Torah scroll in synagogue. The Nevi'im are all of these books in the middle. Some of them are historical, and some of them are prophetic reprimands, basically, to us, the Israelites, to shape up because we've done wrong and how we should do better. Ones that you will have heard of from here are also used often as part of the Haftorah in synagogue, often from the book of Yeshayahu or Yirmiyahu and things like that. Finally, Ketuvim, the writings portion of the Hebrew Bible, are writings. Ones that you will have heard of, most likely, is the book of Psalms, of course, Tehillim, which forms a good portion of our prayer book. And then the 5 Megillot or scrolls that are read as part of the holiday cycle: Song of Songs, Ruth, Eicha, Kohelet, and Esther. Of course, Esther, which will be read coming up next week for the holiday of Purim. So this is all just to give us our bearings. You'll note for also the two of the historical books at the end, we will be referencing again Ezra and Nehemiah, that really talk about a time period drastically different from that all the way at the beginning. Genesis, of course, the creation of the world. And by the time of, let's see here, by the time of Eicha here, the first temple is destroyed. We will see this was built by King Solomon, the son of King David, who we read about here in the book of Kings. And the people are, the nation is destroyed. The temple, God forbid, the temple is destroyed. The nation is exiled around this time of Eicha. And then the people come back to rebuild the second temple here in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So a tremendous amount of history is encompassed here in these books. And that's not really even our main focus for today. I just wanted to catch us up to where we are in history. So back to our terminology, the word Talmud. You might have also heard the word Mishnah. You might have also heard the word Gemara. Truthfully, the word Talmud and Gemara are very often used interchangeably. However, to be precise, the Mishnah is an earlier set of books, and then the Gemara is the later additions and commentaries to it. When you put the two together and they're published together, they're called the Talmud. What we're talking about for the Talmud is here a 64 volume, or we call each of these volumes tractates, a 64 volume corpus of literature. Gigantic. Okay, now you probably want some years. I keep saying I'm not going to talk about years, but I have to talk about years a little bit. As we said, this earlier strata of rabbinic literature is called the Mishnah, and it was put together around the year 200 CE, right? That's 200 after the year 0 in the land of Israel. And the Talmud, the primary Talmud, this is really the one that was written in Babylon, was put together about 400 years later in 600 CE. Now, I'm not using the word author or written in any of these cases, because the truth is that both of these pieces of literature are really made up of layers and layers of generations of different rabbis and ideas and their discussions. So they really represent much more so than the 1 year of their editing or publication. But if we want to just get our heads around it, this is when they were put together and most likely written down. Okay, so the Mishnah in 200 CE and the Talmud in 600 CE. Now, if you're not a history kind of person, and I don't blame you, I think it's really great to be able to just look at a timeline for a minute, because sometimes when we see numbers, it's not quite as helpful as if we can see kind of like a scheme or a chart. So this is an amazing online timeline that I love using. I did not make it up. That actually, if you see, I'm pinching it down smaller again. On one screen, you can see all of Jewish history from really what is believed to be, I guess, the creation of the world from the traditional point of view, all the way up to the year 2000. And then you can dig deeper into the details of it by expanding it to see some more of those details. So the time periods that I'm reflecting on now, what we were talking about, rabbinic literature or the Talmud, really is from, and I apologize for these pop-ups, it's part of the website. So the Talmud was put together, oh, I don't know how to prevent this. Okay, in around, sorry, the year 600, which is right about here. If there were still Jews living in the land of Israel, but the primary Jewish community at that time was really in Babylonia, and that is why it is called the Babylonian Talmud. It was written there. And the Mishnah was put together around this time, as I said, the year 200. And we are also going to be reflecting a little bit, as you'll see in a minute, on this time period that comes before the time of the Mishnah. We'll be defining these texts in a minute, these terms for the time period of the Zugot. We're going backwards in history now almost. It's before the year 0. This is the negative part of the timeline. And the Knesset Haggadola. Before that, we are firmly in the biblical period because we're in the time period of kings and prophets. Before that, the judges. Before that, the patriarchs of the book of Genesis. I know this is a lot of information, by the way. I'm trying to share it with you, though, in a number of different ways, so that I hope, depending on your personal interests and learning style or whatever, some or hopefully all of the information will actually sink in. So in order to understand where we got this information from, how is it that I'm telling you that the Mishnah comes from 200 and the Talmud comes from 600? Unfortunately, we do not have other non-Jewish evidence to corroborate this evidence. We only have it from this historical evidence. We only have it from the Jewish text itself. And we have it particularly from the rabbis themselves, because there is a great desire for the rabbis who did not exist in the time of the Bible. Okay, in case you didn't know that, we'll be looking at that together. For the rabbis who existed after or during the time period of the second Beit HaMikdash temple and and afterwards, after it's destroyed, there's a strong desire for the rabbinic enterprise, for the rabbis and Judaism at that time, to see itself as part of a continuum. The temples, at some point, as you well know, are destroyed. The Bible, as you well know, at some point ended. And so the idea is, though, if the rabbis that came after all of that can connect themselves to those earlier ideas, it gives far more import and legitimacy to what they are trying to do, namely make sure that Judaism survives even outside of the biblical times, outside of the temple, and really, to a certain extent, not centered in the land of Israel. None of those things are a given. They're all things that there were rabbis at the earliest time period of the rabbinic enterprise that is recorded for us in their own for us in their own literature, that they wanted to secure their position as part of this longer, more traditional way of looking at Judaism. Newness and innovation in Judaism, as you well know, even today, is often a hard cause to fight for. Most Jews classically recognize Tevye, saying tradition, as being the kind of way of characterizing what Judaism is all about. We all know that Judaism, of course, is modern as well. After all, I, as a woman, am teaching you all of this stuff on a computer screen right now. But nevertheless, the care and concern of wanting to link back to the past is something that is a very, very strong and important idea in Judaism. So we're going to see how all of that works from the rabbi's point of view. In order to do that, we are going to study a little bit of text together. I'm admitting to you, it's not a whole text. I've kind of chopped it up a little bit, as you'll see as we go along. But we're going to be studying together the first two chapters, or from the first chapters of the most famous, but also probably the most unusual book of the Mishnah, and it's called Pirkei Avot. Some of you might recognize that term, see how it's familiar. By the end of this screen, hopefully we'll be able to put all those pieces together. What do we mean in terms of Mishnah? What is Pirkei Avot? How is it helping us here? Maybe how have you heard of it before? So first of all, it's one of the most well-known of all writings of rabbinic Judaism. We'll see more by the end of the screen. As I said, it is one of the 64 tractates of the Mishnah, 63, excuse me. I might have said 64 before, I'm sorry. And the tractates of the Mishnah, and therefore the Talmud as well. But this is as we're talking about that earlier layer of the Mishnah. It is similar to the other tractates or volumes of the Mishnah because it is made up of short Hebrew statements made by different rabbis with different opinions about Jewish life. But it is a contrast to the rest of the Mishnah because its rabbinic statements and lessons are not connected to Jewish law or halakha. So the other ones are primarily, with teeny tiny exceptions in the Mishnah, primarily focused on legal matters, intricate legal matters, from business to how to keep Shabbat to how to all kinds of things. And this one, though, is more statements, ideas, advice, philosophical ideas. Very Jewish, but not legal. So what we're going to see is that the first few chapters are able to justify the authority of the rabbis by linking them directly back in time all the way to the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, because we're going to see that Torah really becomes the absolute major. If it wasn't the focus in the biblical times, it is, and it was, but it's all the more so in rabbinic times. Now, why you might have heard of it before, I mean, maybe you study Mishnah, but if you don't, there is a tradition to study this text in particular, especially on Shabbat afternoons, and therefore it's actually included in most Sidurim. So even if you don't have an extensive, rabbinic literature library at home, if you have a siddur, if you have a Sidur, you most likely have a copy of Pirkei Avot. All right, so just let me tell you what we're about to study in this, and then I think we'll take a break for questions right before we start studying the text. As I said, and I'd like to be always transparent about what I'm doing, what we're about to read after we take our break for questions are highlights from these chapters 1 and 2. I've left parts out, not that they aren't interesting or important, it's just that they don't serve my purpose today. My purpose today is to show you this continual chain of transmission of tradition, and we'll see how that works. And also we'll see right from the beginning here, there are many opportunities for these rabbis to give us statements about the importance of Torah study and how central it is to rabbinic life, and therefore rabbinic Jewish life. So not just living by the Torah, but studying Torah as well. And we will even have some info in there about women, because even though we're not focusing on women today, it's very hard for me to leave it out of the discussion. So I'm going to stop the share for a moment. Here I am back. And Lindsay, Carol, and the team, let's delve more into the text. I'd love the opportunity to take any questions if you think that would be a good thing to do.
Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat. Jeff, do you want to unmute and talk directly to Anna?
And it's wonderful to hear you again.
Yep.
I had a question okay, outside of this course, which is sponsored by the Women of Adath, do you personally teach a course for us neophytes on the Talmud?
What? Isn't that, what do you mean? Are you
Outside of this
offering me a
course.
job? Jeff, are you offering me a job?
I want to know if you provide a course like, that one could attend or,
Let's get together a group and we will crunch some numbers.
Yeah.
I don't have anything right now. Right now I am working at Chat, and for Women of Adath, I'm happy to entertain other possibilities.
And there is an answer from Bernard Katz to Jeff. So we'll let them discuss that about someplace that, about a book, a really good book that you could use. Okay, Elaine had a question, or Arnie, I don't know. Elaine, are you there? Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I think it was my question, and it is, I've heard of the Babylonian Talmud, but I also heard of the Jerusalem Talmud. So where does it fit into the time period and rabbinic commentary?
Right. So we're not, there are so many other texts that we can also be focusing on. That is one of them. I really limited myself just for the sake of time and hopefully lack of confusion. The Jerusalem Talmud, which actually in academic circles, don't be alarmed, is sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, because at the time the land of Israel was part of the Roman Empire and was called Palestine or Palestina. But it was actually not written in Jerusalem. It was written it was written in the Galil. There were very few Jews. This is after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the Jewish life in Israel had moved northward into the Galilee. And so it was really written mostly in cities like Tiberias, Tiberia, and it was put together about 100 years prior to the Babylonian Talmud. Interestingly, and I've told this to other people recently, the book itself, multi-volume, also very difficult to study, as is the Babylonian text, was not really studied in the Eastern European yeshivot of medieval and early modern Talmud study. So it became not terribly popular. The Jews of Yemen actually are the only ones that I know of that kind of used it. Of course, they're physically closer to the land of Israel, that they used it from earliest times until modern times for halachic consulting. Other than that, until recently, it was mostly used to check certain parallels and used by academics, but not really by rabbis. That being said, it's also a little bit harder to understand because both Talmudim are written in Aramaic, but they're written in different dialects of Aramaic. The Babylonian one in Babylonian Aramaic. There's a lot of info. You asked the questions, I'm giving it to you. And the Palestinian one in the Eretz Yisrael one in Palestinian Aramaic. That being said, about a month ago, first ever English translation of the Jerusalem Talmud was published free on the internet responsibly by the amazing Sefaria.org. And so now it actually is accessible. So it will be fascinating to me to see 5 and 10 years down the road if somehow it takes off in a little bit more popularity, because it actually is accessible now and it has never been before. I hope that answered your question. And I'm sorry for going off on a bit of a rant.
No,
As you
okay.
can tell, I kind of like this stuff. So.
We like your rants. It's okay.
Okay.
Does anybody else have a question before we go back to Anna's? No? Okay, Anna, on you go.
Okay. Here we go. Before I go back to the screen share. So we're going to be studying some text together. I'm just giving you a heads up. And at the very end, I'm going to have to watch the time. I kind of made a chart where we can see everything on one screen together to, again, hopefully try to put those pieces of the puzzle together. So if you're losing, the thread of exactly how all the history is going, don't worry. Just enjoy the text for what it is. And then when we get to the end, hopefully you'll see it all together in that chart. Okay? Okay. Is everything funny? Is everything okay? Okay.
All good, all good.
Okay, good. Good. I know. They're having a great time in Florida. There are pina coladas happening. There might be if some people are, enjoying their vacation. Good, which you should. All right, here we go. Back to learning some Mishnah together. Mishnah Pirkei Avot. Okay, so as I said, we have selections here from chapters 1 and 2. Let me tell you what I've done here with my bolding on the screen. What we're trying to do now is see how the leaders, we're starting back in Moses. We're in a pre-rabbinic period here. We're going to see how our leaders pass down the Torah and everything about the Torah, first orally and then eventually in writing. We're starting off in Moses, and we're going to get to, in a few screens, all the way to the Mishnah. Okay, so it's a different kind of timeline. It's not the kind of timeline that I showed you before with numbers. It's a timeline of generations and of traditions. What I've done for you is the first time each of these men, and they're all men as we will see, each of the men or groups of men are written down in this text. I've bolded them for you, so hopefully there'll be a visual here for seeing this continuum of tradition. And then other words are in here either just to make sense grammatically, or sometimes we're going to use this as an opportunity to learn some ideas, as I said, about the centrality of Torah study. All right, so it starts off like this. Moses, okay, this is it, the one and only. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua is the leader of the people after Moses, chosen by God, who will immediately after Moses' death, will take the children of Israel into the land of Israel and lead them in the conquering of the land of Israel. Okay, so after Joshua passes down this information to the elders, the Zikanim. This is a little bit amorphous to us. We don't have names attached here, but basically the leaders of the Jewish people before the prophets started being the religious leaders. Again, remember, we don't have rabbis as religious leaders yet. And what we often have is the political and the religious leader tied up in one or in one entity. And so that's probably what's representative here of the elders. After the elders, we get to the prophets. After, as we said, there's a whole section of the Tanakh named for the prophets. And then after the prophets, the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly, in Hebrew, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, are not actually mentioned in the Tanakh itself, but tradition has it that around the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah, as I pointed out to you on that other screen, who were the leaders of the Jewish people when they came back after the destruction of the first temple, were probably the men of the Great Assembly. So it's a different kind of leader at that time. So what we have here is an attempt to show a flow of passing of tradition from leader to protege, or from teacher to student. Then of the men of the Great Assembly, the last says here, right, Shimon or Simon the Righteous was one of the last of the men of the Great Assembly. And the Great Assembly, we don't really have their names, but we have the last one. So that's very important for us if we're going to figure out who comes next after, how we're going to pass it along legitimately. Before we see who Shimon the Righteous is going to pass it on to, we have a little break here to learn something of one of Shimon's famous statements that's recorded for us here. He used to say, and of course, many of you have heard this statement before, the world stands on three great things: on the Torah, the service, the avodah, which could be the temple service or it could be the prayer service, depending on if we're pre-temple or post-temple, and the practice of acts of piety, usually translated as Gemilut Chasadim. So basically, if you had to say what are the three most important things of the world, according to Shimon the righteous, it is Torah, the service of God, and acts of loving kindness towards our fellow human beings. We see here Torah as the first one. Okay, keep that in mind, please. All right, next. The person that received it from Shimon the righteous was someone named Antigonus, a man of Soho. At a certain point, we do start to see Greek-sounding names in our tradition. I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyway, so Shimon the righteous passed it on to him. And then what we have here is names that are now, here, the names that we're about to see now. I think it's 5 or 6 of them, 5 pairs of names that the leadership kind of diversifies or changes at this point. We don't have one leader to one apprentice or next in line, but we have pairs of leaders who are leading. So they're in Hebrew, that's called zugot, or in English, that is pairs. So the first of the pairs received this tradition, all of the tradition from Shimon the Tzaddik, and their names were Yossi ben Yozer of Tzareda and Yossi ben Yochanan of Jerusalem. They also, the first one of them, Yossi ben Yozer, also has a kind of statement that he is famous for. Again, keeping in mind that, as I said, these are rabbinic statements that are outside of the realm of halacha or of law. They're more ideas of recommendations, of advice, of ethics, of philosophy. He said, let your house be a house of meeting for the sages. Okay, this is for the rabbis. So we're seeing here a centrality of rabbis in Torah study. And sit in the very dust of their feet. We're seeing that they're important, perhaps more important than us. And drink in their words of thirst. So we're starting to see here that we have traditions passed all the way back from Mount Sinai. And now we're starting to see a more of a focus on a rabbinic component here in terms of the transmission and importance of rabbis. The second one of that pair, Yossi ben Yochanan, Jerusalem, used to say, let your house be wide open and let the poor be members of your household. Beautiful statement. We don't see Torah yet. We're going to see a hint of Torah in the next statement, and this is a trigger warning for you, for the women in the crowd. Engage not in too much conversation with women. What? Okay, so here is our reminder that we are talking about probably just before the year 0, heavily patriarchal, ancient Near Eastern society, and men and women are not equal to each other. Okay, so this becomes tremendously important as the study of Torah becomes so central to the enterprise of Judaism. And for the most part, 99.999% of women are left out of that enterprise and really are until, about 100 years ago or a little bit earlier than that. So let's see a bit of this. He says, engage not to, they said, this is a continuation. They said this with regard to one's own wife. You're not even supposed to talk to your wife very much. How much more so with regard to another man's wife? I added the exclamation point, by the way. From here, the sages said, a further explanation of Yossi ben Yochanan's statement, as long as a man engages in too much conversation, he, be careful, men on the crowd, on the Zoom here, causes evil to himself, neglects the study of Torah. Okay, so that's why I brought it in here also, to show the centrality of Torah. And in the end will inherit Gehenna or hell. So really bad news to speak too much with women. Okay, so again, it's a reminder here that we are studying history, and history is not the same as necessarily how many practice today or believe today, but I think that it is important to remember our history as well.
Anna, there's a question, just let me throw this one in.
Yes.
Somebody's asking, do you interpret conversation with women to mean gossip?
No, it's any conversation.
That's worse. Okay.
Gossip isn't allowed with anybody, men or women. No, this means just talking. All right. Next, we have two other sets of pairs or zukim here, and zugot, excuse me. Joshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arabelite received from them the tradition, and there's some things that they said, I left them out. Then the next group here, Judah ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach received from them. And then Shmaya and Avtalyon. I believe this is the second last pair. We'll see on the next screen. And we have a statement here from Avtalyon, used to say, sages, be careful with your words. Okay, now he's addressing the rabbis. On one hand, we've brought them up and said they're so important. You should sit by the dust of their feet. But what I really appreciate here is a certain kind of, it's not democracy and it's not equality, but a certain type of democratization here in that we do not see the rabbis and the sages as saints. We recognize that they can make mistakes and that we better watch out for that just in case, and our ancient rabbis warn us of it. Be careful with your words, lest you incur the penalty of exile and be carried off to the place of evil waters. I don't even know what that means, but something bad. And the disciples who follow you drink and die, and thus the name of heaven becomes profane. So rabbis, you're important. You've continued on the tradition, but don't get too full of yourself and be super careful of what you say, because you have a tremendous amount of influence and you shouldn't abuse it. Finally, we have here Hillel and Shammai. You've probably heard of Hillel and Shammai from various stories before. And we have that they are the last of these zugot, of these pairs, which are kind of like a pre-rabbinic kind of a position. Hillel used to say, so they received the tradition from the generation that came before them. Hillel used to say, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace. After all, we all are thinking about peace, I think, in our days today. Loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah. Okay, here's some, don't just be a good person, lovely, yes, good, but Torah. Remember, that's the focus. Shammai used to say, make your study of the Torah a fixed practice. Like, you don't just say, I'm going to do it, like you have to formalize it. Speak little, but do much. Also, lovely advice. And receive all men with a pleasant countenance, with a nice face. Treat everyone nicely. Now, for the first time, we are seeing the title rabbi appear. Okay, so the next generation that we're seeing here where this information is passed down to is a very famous rabbi that we will read about another time together, Rabbi Gamliao. Rabban is kind of like a more formal, fancier name for rabbi in that earlier time period. And his statement is, appoint for yourself a teacher. Okay, that means, set your times for Torah like we saw before. And, you should be learning it with a teacher because you're continuing the tradition in that way. You're not just making it up on your own. Shimon, his son, used to say, all of my days I grew up among the sages, and I found nothing better than a person than silence. Study is not the most important thing, but actions. Okay, I love this little interjection here because we're really focusing on the importance of study and Torah and continuum to the past. And we have a reminder here that it's not just study, that it's action that's important as well. Beautiful idea, I think. Then we have someone named Rabbi here who we're going to see more about in a minute. And then finally, we have Rabbi Gamliao, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah Hanasi. Actually, that is the rabbi that we've referred to in the line before. I'll show you that in a minute. And he said, excellent is the study of Torah when combined with a worldly occupation, for toil in both of them keeps sin out of one's mind. Also, an amazing Jewish concept that even though, of course, we know we do have brothers and now sisters who sit all day and study Torah, as a matter of fact, the Jewish conception from ancient times is that study of Torah is important, but having a job is important also. Okay, that is a lot of information. What I tried to convey to you there was a rabbinic perspective of the history of Torah and how it's transmitted, written Torah and oral Torah. I've got to tie that in together for you. I haven't quite yet. And we saw that all from Pirkei Avot. And as an extra bonus, we saw these important statements about the centrality of rabbis, the centrality of Torah stage of Torah study, but also the qualification that we need to be careful and we have to recognize they're human, they can mess up, and that we should have our nose in the books as well as in the outside world as well. All right, this is the graph that I put together that I promised you. I've got to move this thing out of the way. Oh no, I hope it all shows up. All right, so the graph of tried to put some of the ideas together. I think you see a gray line at the bottom, but I'll move it when we need to. So if you see at the top, you see a line across books, transmission of tradition, and time period. So let's look at the concept of books first of all. When we're talking about the transmission of tradition, you know, I had a teacher many years ago that sometimes when you're learning other histories of different countries in Europe, very often they talk about their different time periods based on, you know, what wars they went through at certain times. Or sometimes they talk about, or in North America too, you know, what innovations existed at those times, the Iron Age, or the time like the 70 Years War, or whatever, that they kind of name their time periods by that. In Judaism, in traditional Judaism, we tend to name our time periods by the Jewish books that were produced at that time period. So we have the biblical time period, we have the Second Temple period. I see I've messed up with the spelling here. And actually, a lot of my words are missing on this. Something's missing for this. I made a mistake here, but okay, we'll deal with it. The biblical time period, the time period of the oral Torah or the Mishnah and the Talmud, okay? So let's start off at the top here. As we see, these are, remember we read the very first line from Pirkei Avot. It said Moses received the Torah at Sinai. He received it from, and then he gave it to Joshua. He passed it down to the elders. He passed it down to the prophets. They passed it down to this and passed it down to this and passed it to this. All generally conceived as the biblical time period. And then the written Torah is from that time period, or really more comprehensively, the whole Tanakh, not just the 5 books of the Torah. Traditionally, it is believed that in addition to all of the ideas that were in the written Torah, that a lot of commentaries, ideas, and extra information were also taught to Moses by God on Mount Sinai, and were also passed down orally through all of this leadership as well. And all of that information, the tradition, as well as the written text, was then passed down to the Zugot as we saw them. So we're going to see those pairs. Remember, we saw those pairs of people, the 1 to 6 pairs. This is from the Second Temple period. But before that, as you can see, there's a line of confusion here on my graph, question marks, because when we have here, this should say Second Temple. I'm sorry, I don't know whether the typing didn't come out properly. Second Temple is built around the year 500 BCE, but the pairs, this time period of the pairs, starts at about 170 BCE. So we have what is sometimes called here a bit of the dark ages of Judaism. Not that they're dark and that bad things happened or there wasn't innovation, but we don't have Jewish literature to support it. So we don't know a tremendous amount about it. So we are going to assume, as the rabbis did, that there still was an unbroken chain of tradition from Moses all the way down through the pairs and further, even though we don't have record of it. So we have here, though, the pairs. They were written for us. We read them in Pirkei Avot. They are all during the Second Temple period. I did a little icon here for you of a Chanukiah, just to give you a little bit of a sense. Many of you know the story of Hanukkah happened around the year 165 BCE. So that would have happened around this time period here, just to give you a little bit of context. Then we had the named rabbis. So the kind of information that they are dealing with is very often referred to as the oral Torah. And at that time, it really was oral. It wasn't written down. We had the written Bible up here, the Tanakh, but we did not have anything else written down. But there was a lot of tradition and rabbinic innovation that happened at this time, and it remained oral and is called the oral Torah. We needed to get until by the year, and I'm sorry, on this screen, it has, oh no, there, it came back. It is last here, you'll see the last number at the bottom of the screen is 200 CE, is the time that we saw before when the Mishnah was written down, because we have these early rabbis that appeared after the time of the Zugot that we saw mentioned in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Gamliao, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliao, Rabbi Judah Hanasi, and it is he that I put him in bold because he is the one that put together the Mishnah. Okay, traditionally is believed to be that he is called the Nasi, or the prince, or the patriarch, because he was tremendously important. He is sometimes actually, I believe Rambam calls him Hakadosh, the Holy One, because he did the tremendous work of collecting all of the oral literature that existed before and organizing it and putting it down in the Mishnah. We really see this as the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism, so very necessary because the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And it's not just like the next day the Jews could wake up and go, okay, no problem, we'll figure it out. It was a tremendous challenge to figure out how to be innovative but have the importance of tradition and continue this chain of tradition in order to progress and survive after the destruction of the temple and the exile that came with it. And we call that Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is very much characterized by the literature that they produce. And that first piece of literature is the Mishnah. So just to remind you, this screen, we've seen it already. We were supposed to talk about Talmud today, but in order to do that, I needed to catch you all up and get you to the beginnings of Talmud. And the beginnings of Talmud are really the kind of seed core text that came before, namely the Mishnah. The Mishnah is then commented on and added to and commentated for 400 years in what we call the Gemara, and all of that is put together in the Talmud around the year 600 CE. There's a lot of information I just gave you. Even if you remember every detail, amazing. But if you don't, I hope it helped put some of those pieces of the puzzle together to give you context and hopefully appreciation for these texts that are absolutely vital to the Judaism that we continue to practice today. Questions?
Okay, we don't, there aren't other questions here, but there was one question earlier that Jeff had asked, and somebody in the chat answered him. Just want to ask you about a good book for beginning Talmud, a good book, and where can you buy it? Can you buy it in Toronto, or do you have to order it? What would you recommend?
I might have to give it some thought for next time.
Okay.
I think probably it depends on if you're looking for ideas or context or actual text, or a combination. There, and books that I've used on this, sometimes I have to make sure that they're still in print. There is a book by professor at JTS called, his name is Barry Holtz, and very often it's a textbook, but it's a very accessible textbook. I think his name was Holtz. Back to the Sources, yeah, it is, okay. A book called Back to the Sources, And I see it's available on Amazon. I'm just looking on my phone here as we're speaking. And it is basically, I think what he does is divide up into chapters, the different kind of, here it says here, the first modern great books of the Jewish tradition, what they are and how to read them. So, and it's edited by him. So I guess each chapter is written by a expert in the field. The book is old by now, but very often it was used like in kind of intro to Judaism or intro to great books of Judaism courses like in university, but I think it's very accessible. And so for instance, I'm assuming there's like a chapter on Talmud, a chapter on Midrash, a chapter on Mishnah and things like that. And then I would probably use that as a jumping off point. And that's all I can think of right at this minute. It is an old book, so you might be able to find it used, or it might still be in publication because, as I said, it's a very handy, useful book.
Thank you.
Yes, I see someone else. Cheryl, you have a question? Want to unmute yourself?
I am. Okay, thank you. You just said before that they have in the Siddur,
Yes.
so is this under, I have one in my hand from my
Oh, good.
shul. Yes, from the
Right.
days when I had to daven from here. So is this under, it's like prayers, readings, reflections, and study sources? Would that
No,
be
it's
it?
probably in Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. It's probably it
This is
might
in
be
English,
Shabbat
so
afternoon.
this
Right.
is
Is it
yeah,
the Shabbat
this is,
one or it's only a weekday? Is it a weekday Siddur or Shabbat Siddur
yeah, no,
also?
it's a weekday Siddur.
Oh
No,
no,
it's a Shabbat. It's a
oh,
Shabbat.
it is Shabbat. Okay.
Shabbat
So
and festivals, yeah.
if you look at Shabbat, if you look in the table of contents,
Yeah.
I'm just guessing here, like an educated guess, and it'll say morning service, it'll say Musaf, and then it might say Mincha afternoon service, and
Yeah.
it might be around that time. It would say they might call it Ethics of the Fathers or Pirkei Avot.
Yeah, it's too bad it's not in Hebrew because like the English does not ring. I
Not
mean,
say it doesn't say ethics.
no, it doesn't say that. I'll look again.
So
but
you might
if
have a
not,
shortened version if you want to.
if
I
not,
don't
I'll
have
ask.
Cedar
I'll
with
ask
me.
Rabbi Cutler on Shabbat when I see him. So he,
Yes, amazing. He
okay.
will love that question.
Sure.
He
Okay.
will love that question. We're not going to be studying it more, but
Okay.
if you want to do self-study on your own, they really are very interesting, beautiful statements. There's tons of commentary in English on them. Very, as it comes to rabbinic texts, it's the most accessible. It is the
Okay.
most accessible, and it gives you a nice feel of like kind of the flow where it'll say, Rabbi so-and-so says something,
Okay. Okay.
and
Great.
then it'll be sometimes someone will disagree, someone will agree, or they'll just move on to the next one. And there are really wonderful commentaries. They're very short and accessible in English. And Rabbi Cutler for sure could recommend that one of those to you as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Anyone else? I love that everyone's looking for extra work already. Guys, there's no extra credit here. There's no, you're not getting marked. But
No more
everyone's
questions?
asking for extra credit work anyway, which is
Oh, wait, I
amazing.
got something in the chat. Hold on.
Okay.
I don't know. Somebody else asked something in the chat. I can't get it.
Right, how did the sages become?
Oh,
How
it
did
says,
the sages become rabbis? Who
Right.
appointed them and how did they qualify as rabbis? Janice is shy.
okay, so sages and rabbis are really interchangeable in Judaism and ancient Judaism. So you might have also heard the term Chazal, which means Chachamim Zikronam Livracha, which means our sages of blessed memory. Same thing as rabbis. So rabbis, even until today, in the Orthodox world, a little bit less so in conservative reform, etc., still use the word smicha when they refer to how someone becomes a rabbi, or that they don't. They're in the conservative movement, they're often ordained as rabbi, and in Orthodoxy they get smicha. Smicha means officially the laying on of hands, which probably is a metaphor. It certainly is a metaphor today. But really what it's meant to do is to demonstrate that the teacher, and it ties in exactly with what we were talking about, that the teacher has a tradition and then has a disciple, a student that then is ready and prepared and studying to a certain amount of material. Again, in formal modern seminaries, they have formal curricula, but in days of old, it was just basically you studied with a rabbi for long enough until he thought you were ready, and then he literally passed on the tradition to you by a symbolic laying on of hands that was a way of maintaining and continuing this chain of tradition. You've studied with someone a generation older than you. He decided that you were now ready to go on and be a leader yourself. And so therefore, he gave you the formal title of rabbi that you would then change from like a yeshiva student to a rabbi if the rabbi who was your generation above you saw that you were now prepared to continue on in this chain of tradition. So it ties really back to this whole idea that we've been talking about, that this concern, this desire to demonstrate that what we have, even if and when it feels new, is still ancient because it can be traced all the way back even to Moses.
Thank you. We have one more.
Yes.
Did Maimonides, Rambam, structure the Talmud? Did he change or update any of the comments? Particularly, has anyone updated the comments about women?
Can you write that down for the next course, please?
Sure.
Ready, Carol? Because I don't think I can do that one quickly. Rambam is from the medieval period, and so he comes later than the time of the Talmud. That being said, the Talmud, which I was not planning on doing with us, is actually multi-layered in and of itself. Even after it is put together in the year 600, the different commentaries and comments are then included, and eventually, I'm drawing a page in my hand, eventually, by the time the printing press was invented, was printed in such a way so that the main text of the Talmud was in the middle and the commentaries are around the edge. Some commentaries, though, are so prolific that they need to be published in a separate book of their own. Rambam, one of the most brilliant halachists and Jewish minds ever, quite frankly, wrote books of commentary of law and philosophy and things like that. And he is not, though, included on the page of the Talmud. I see a question, another question. Yes. Now you've gotten me into medieval halacha here. So this is really a whole new topic. Okay, go ahead.
Arnie, can you ask a quick question and then we're going to have to say goodbye?
Wasn't there one of the ancient rabbis or the medieval rabbis responsible for taking the kind of the disorganized approach, stream of conscious approach to the
I like that better.
Talmud and then sort of codifying it?
Yes, that would be Rambam is one of the prime examples in his book called the Mishnah Torah, which, by the way, do not confuse it with the Mishnah because it's not the same as the Mishnah. It's the Mishnah Torah, which really means the repeat or repetition of the Torah. What he did I think I always forget the dates, around the 12th or 13th century, I think, because he had an absolute brilliant mind, recognized that the amount of rabbinic literature that had been produced up until that point had become like impossible for any one person to know how to access. Don't forget, this is before you could, search for something on the internet, and things didn't have indexes either. And so he took many of the main ideas, especially pertaining to law, and he codified them exactly as you said, in an organized manner so that they could be usable in a more practical way. And that set of books, again, you couldn't just do it in one book, it's a set of books, is called the Mishnah Torah, and that is medieval, so post-Talmudic.
Did you say that? Okay, wow. And I said to Carol, I'm really glad that we don't have to write an exam. That's what I said.
I know, I knew this was a lot of material today.
A lot.
I
No,
hope
but it
it
was
doesn't
great.
turn anybody off. as I said, there's no test. Next, the other ones afterwards are more thematic. And so it's going to have a different feel to it. But I really felt that for me, it felt like the responsible thing to do was to share these ideas with you today, because not only the historical context, but the kind of terminology and things that we'll be using. It was kind of an intro to that today. Now, that being said, if your friends want to come and they didn't come today, we'll still make it work for them, or they can watch it. Often this goes up on the YouTube, on the shul's YouTube. If not, though, and you don't remember anything from today, don't worry. We'll make it work for you the next times as well.
Well, I know that for some of us, it was a great review, and for some it was, new material, but either way, I think it was very useful. And and we have one comment in the chat that says kudos once again. So I think that says it. I want to thank
you for giving me the opportunity. As you can tell, I kind of like talking about this stuff.
Thank you for doing it with us.
It's nice for me also.
We appreciate your enthusiism. I want to thank everybody else for coming, and tell your friends, and remember, this is number one. This is number one. That everyone is welcome. This is number one of a 6-part series. The next one is March 23rd.
We have a happy Purim next week. Happy Purim.
Happy Purim.
We're missing.
We will be starting on March 23rd. We will be starting at 1:30. Sorry. So most of the the rest of the sessions will be at 1:30. Okay, today was an exception. So 1:30, 2 weeks from now, same time. Some of us will be in the same place. Some of us won't. And
zoom in from wherever you are.
We hope to see you all then. Everybody have a happy Purim.
Yeah.
If you want to stay around for a few minutes to chat, that'd be great. But we'll say goodbye to Anne, unless you want to sit around to chat.
No, I'm going to skip Kiddush then. Okay, guys.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you.
I'm going to leave because my walking partner is ready. So I have to go get ready, but it's so nice to see everybody. And we'll see you next week. And